The last assault at Fort Breshe. I remember the cold. Not the kind that makes you shiver, but the kind that seeps into your bones, making you wonder if you'll ever feel warm again. It was early December, somewhere deep in the heart of Germany, and Fort Bresche loomed ahead like a beast of stone, its thick walls scarred but unyielding. They had tried to bomb it into oblivion, but the damn thing was built to withstand hell itself. Command said we had no choice, we had to take it. And I, Alex Connors, was the unlucky bastard whose job was to carve a path through its defenses, one step at a time, one charge at a time. They call me a sapper, but in moments like this, I felt more like a gambler with the worst odds in the world. The artillery had pounded the place for hours, but as soon as the shelling stopped, the machine guns sang their murderous tune. The trenches in front of the fort were littered with bodies, and every step forward felt like a promise to join them. I knew the mines were waiting. Somewhere between me and those walls, death lay buried in the dirt, patient and silent. I clutched the wire cutters in my frozen fingers, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. A whisper from my sergeant, "Move." So I moved, crawling through the mud, feeling the weight of 100 unseen eyes on me. I searched for the deadly wires. Flash of metal. There. A tripwire, thin as a strand of hair, stretched across the ground. I traced it to its source, my pulse hammering in my ears. A shumai, small, cruel. It didn't just kill. It maimed, turning men into burdens instead of corpses. I reached out, steady hands betraying the fear coiling in my gut. Cut the wire, ease it out. A slow breath. Movement ahead. My eyes flicked up, just a shadow. But shadows here meant death. The rifle in my hands felt too slow, too clumsy. A heartbeat later, the shadow moved again, slipping back behind cover. Watching, waiting. I forced myself to keep going. The mines weren't going to clear themselves, and we needed that passage open. Another step. Another wire. Sweat mixed with dirt on my face. My body numb from the cold, from fear, from the weight of knowing that one mistake, just one, would be the end. Then a sound. Soft, but unmistakable. The click of a pressure plate being triggered. My stomach turned to ice. I knew what came next. The sound echoed in my brain as I froze, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move, to run, to do anything except stand there, but I knew there was no point. The mine had been triggered. It was only a matter of time. I didn't dare breathe, didn't dare shift a muscle. The minutes felt like hours, each second stretching out like an eternity. I couldn't tell if the pressure plate would give, or if it was just a faint, hollow whisper of a false alarm. But in that moment, in that sliver of space between life and death, there was nothing but that awful, deafening silence, the kind that comes right before disaster strikes. I had heard stories. Men who'd stood in that same position, knowing full well that the world around them could explode in an instant, that all their preparation, all their training, might come to nothing in the blink of an eye. That was the nature of our work, silent, methodical, and terrifyingly unpredictable. We lived with the knowledge that one wrong step, 1 second of distraction, could end it all. But standing there, feeling the weight of that mine ready to claim me, I realized it wasn't just the possibility of death that gripped me, it was the certainty of it. I knew deep down that if that pressure plate had been activated, I would never see the light of day again. And yet, I did nothing. There was no panic. No desperate scramble to run. There was only the cold, calculating focus that I had learned to embrace as a sapper, because panic only brought disaster. And somehow in that frozen moment, I found something I hadn't expected: control. The tension stretched on, and then finally the faintest of sounds, the click of the mechanism releasing, a sign that the pressure plate had failed. I let out a breath, the first full one I'd taken in what felt like an eternity. It wasn't over, though. It never was. I moved again, as quickly as I dared, every nerve on edge, my senses heightened. The mine was disarmed, but there were more ahead, countless others, each one as deadly as the last. I pressed on, my mind focused solely on the task, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that we were being watched, that we were walking into a trap. But there was no time for doubts, no time for second-guessing. I had a job to do. The wire cutters snipped, my hands moving on their own, the work almost mechanical now. But my mind was elsewhere. My thoughts kept drifting to the men waiting behind me, the infantry that needed the path cleared, the ones whose survival depended on the passage I was creating. There was a strange kind of solidarity among us soldiers. We weren't just fighting for ourselves anymore. We were fighting for each other, for the guy next to you, the one who'd share his last bit of rations and still make you laugh even when the world was falling apart. And yet, I knew I was walking a line. I had seen men before me falter in moments like this, had seen them crumble under the weight of the task, consumed by the fear of what lay ahead. The war, this madness, had a way of chipping away at you, bit by bit. There were men who had gone into these situations before, with that same calm exterior, only to break the next day, their minds fractured, their eyes hollow. I couldn't let that happen to me. I had to hold it together, for my men, for myself. But that was the problem. The deeper I went into the fort's defenses, the more I felt the walls closing in, the more the weight of it all pressed on my shoulders, the more I realized that there was no easy way out, no clean finish. Just one step, one move after another. No promises of survival. Only the bare, ugly truth that we were all part of the machine, grinding away, hoping that we wouldn't be the ones left behind. And then I heard it. A distant, muffled sound, almost like the earth itself was shifting, groaning under the weight of something larger than the war. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, the stress and exhaustion getting to me. But no, there was something there, something more. A rumble, a vibration in the ground. It was faint, but it was there. My heart raced as I looked around, my mind frantically searching for the source. Was it a bomb? Was the fort collapsing? But no, it wasn't that. The ground seemed to pulse with something almost alive, something unnatural, like the very earth was reacting to the horrors unfolding above it. And as I squatted there in that trench, halfway through my task, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was coming, whatever was causing this tremor, it was not just the rumblings of war. It was something darker, something I couldn't understand yet. And in that moment, I realized something even more chilling. This wasn't just about clearing minds. It wasn't just about getting to the fort's gates. This was the beginning of something far worse. Something none of us had prepared for. Something that was coming for all of us, whether we liked it or not. I couldn't explain it. Not then. Not even now. But as the rumble intensified, as the air grew thick with an almost palpable sense of dread, I knew that whatever came next was going to change everything. And in the pit of my stomach, I could feel the familiar sting of fear. Because deep down, I knew we were not alone in that fort. And whatever was waiting for us wasn't going to be kind. The rumble didn't stop. It grew stronger, sending tremors through the ground beneath my feet. I knelt there frozen, as if the earth itself had suddenly come alive, ready to swallow me whole. The distant, muffled sounds now seemed more like an approaching storm, a force I couldn't see, but could certainly feel. It wasn't the usual chaos of war, the shelling, the machine gun fire, the cries of men dying in trenches. No, this was different. It was something else. I strained my ears, trying to catch any hint of what might be causing it. Nothing. Just the deafening roar of my own heartbeat. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to gauge whether anyone else felt it. But the men behind me, those who had followed me through the hellish landscape, were just as focused, just as intent on their task. No one seemed to have noticed. No one but me. I turned back to my work, my hands steady despite the rising panic in my chest. There was no room for hesitation. The minefield lay in front of me like a labyrinth of death, each step a calculation, each move a gamble. And yet, my mind couldn't shake that growing sense of unease, the sense that I was not alone out here. That something was watching us. Not the Germans, not the enemy, but something older, something more ancient. My hands kept moving, cutting, disarming. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the noise, the rumble. And now the faintest whisper on the wind, a sound I couldn't place, but it felt wrong. Like the forest itself had turned against us. Like something deep within the earth had stirred and decided it had enough of our wars, enough of our bloodshed. A cold chill ran down my spine. I had heard stories. Not from soldiers, not from anyone who had been there. But stories nonetheless. Stories whispered in the dead of night, passed down from men who had come back from hell and lived to tell about it. Stories of strange occurrences, things that couldn't be explained. Some of the men talked about shadows moving in the distance, shapes that didn't belong. Some spoke of whispers in the wind, words that no one could understand, but that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. I had always dismissed those stories as superstition. After all, we were soldiers. We didn't have time for ghost stories and legends. We had a job to do, a war to win. But now I wasn't so sure. The ground beneath me shuddered again, more violent this time. It wasn't a tremor, it was the feeling of something pressing down on us. Something heavy, something with purpose. I tried to shake it off. I had no time for distractions. The infantry was waiting. They were counting on me to get them through this, to clear the mines, to make the way safe. But I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something had shifted in air, something that had changed the course of the day. I crawled forward, my mind working to steady my thoughts. I had to focus. There was no room for fear. The walls of the fort were close now, just ahead. We were getting closer to the heart of it, and with it, the real danger. I could feel the weight of the history of this place. Fort Breshe had stood for centuries. It had weathered wars, sieges, and battles, only to be filled with the blood of soldiers like me. It was more than just stone and mortar. It was a place of death, of memories, and of loss. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the fort was holding something back. I cut another wire. Another tripwire, another mine. One by one, I cleared the path, inching my way toward the walls of the fort, but my mind kept circling back to the strange sensations, the strange tremors in the earth, as though the very ground itself was unsettled. The wind had shifted, and the sky was growing darker. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the trench. It was then that I heard the voice. Not a whisper, not a sound carried on the wind, but something deep in my bones, something I couldn't ignore. A voice that wasn't mine, wasn't anyone's, but it was there, clear and undeniable. Turn back. It was a soft command, a whisper, but it carried weight. It chilled me to my core. My hand froze mid-motion, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I looked over my shoulder again. But there was nothing. No one behind me. The men, still moving forward, didn't seem to notice anything unusual. They were just soldiers doing their duty like me. But that voice, that whisper, it lingered. I took a deep breath, shook my head, and refocused. It was nothing. Just the strain of the job, the isolation, the pressure of the mission. I had to keep moving. The infantry was counting on me. We had to break through. We had to take the fort. But as I crept closer to the base of the fort's wall, something shifted in the air again. The ground trembled beneath me, stronger this time, more deliberate. A low hum, almost imperceptible, vibrated in the air. It wasn't coming from the fort. It was coming from deeper within the earth. I could feel it now, deep in my chest, as if the whole place were alive, as if the earth was holding its breath, waiting for something. And in that moment, it felt as if time itself had stopped. I took another step forward, but the voice came again, louder this time, a low guttural tone. Turn back. This time, I didn't ignore it. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick now, charged with something unnatural, something I couldn't explain. I stood there motionless, every sense on high alert. The earth beneath my feet hummed, and the walls of the fort seemed to loom taller, darker, as if they were watching me, waiting. The men behind me were still pushing forward, not a clue in the world. But I knew. Something was wrong. The rumbling, the voice, the unease in the air, whatever was in that fort, whatever was waiting inside, it wasn't just the enemy. It was something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting for us. And then I saw it. A figure, a shadow, flitting between the trees at the edge of the fort, too quick to be real, but there nonetheless. A shape, indistinct, yet unmistakable. It didn't belong. And just like that, the chill that had crept into my bones turned to ice. I couldn't explain what I was seeing. I couldn't explain what I was feeling. But one thing was certain. Whatever lay ahead, it was not going to be a fight we could win. I stood frozen, my body a mix of tension and disbelief. The shadow I'd seen, no, the figure, was gone, vanished into the gathering dusk like smoke caught in a gust of wind. For a moment, everything felt still, too still. The hum in the air, the vibrations in the earth, the whisper in my ears, all of it seemed to pulse in time with the very beat of my heart. The war, the mission, the mines, all of it felt distant, fading into the background, overshadowed by something I couldn't grasp, something I couldn't explain. The men around me continued their task, moving forward as if nothing had changed. The chatter of soldiers, The sound of boots in the mud, the occasional shout from a fellow sapper. They were just following orders, doing what they'd been trained to do. But I wasn't like them right now. I wasn't thinking about the mission or the next mine I had to disarm. My mind was consumed with the thought that something terrible, something otherworldly, was waiting for us inside that fort. Turn back. The voice whispered in my mind again, as if the very walls of the fort were calling to me. The strange sense of urgency and dread pressed in on me, making every breath I took feel heavier, like the air itself was pushing me down. I shook my head, trying to focus, trying to tell myself that I was overreacting. That was just the stress getting to me, the fatigue of too many days spent in the trenches. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Whatever I had felt, whatever I had seen, there was something dark inside that fort. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more I felt it clawing at the edges of my mind. I was about to take another step, but then a loud crack, followed by a thud, broke through the tension. A mine? One of the men behind me had triggered it. I didn't even need to look. I could hear the screams, the desperate, panicked cries that came immediately after the explosion. I spun around, instinctively running toward the sound. But as I did, my heart twisted in my chest. There were no bodies lying in the mud, no one stumbling out from behind the fort's walls. Just the remnants of a blast, a crater in the ground where nothing seemed to have happened at all. No blood, no broken limbs. It was as if the explosion had erased the men who had triggered it from existence. I stumbled forward, my head spinning. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Where were the men? The blast had been real. I had heard it. I had felt it shake the ground beneath me. But the soldiers were gone. Only an empty crater, the edges still smoking. That's when it hit me. It wasn't the mine. It wasn't just the blast. It was the fort. Something had happened to those men. Something had pulled them in, swallowed them whole, leaving nothing but an empty hole where they had once stood. The thought sent a shiver up my spine. I wasn't alone. I never had been. A figure appeared again, just beyond the crater, half hidden behind the silhouette of a destroyed building. It was like a shadow, but it wasn't. It moved, shifting in the way shadows shouldn't. This time, I didn't just see it out of the corner of my eye. No, I saw it clearly. It was tall, unnaturally so. The kind of tall that made your skin crawl. Its outline was indistinct, as if it couldn't decide whether it was made of solid matter or mist. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was featureless, an empty void beneath a hood, and its arms stretched out impossibly long. For a moment, I could swear I heard it breathing, its exhale a slow, haunting sound that seemed to echo in the silence around us. The figure didn't move, not at first. It just stood there watching, waiting. My mind screamed at me to run, to turn and flee as fast as I could. But my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was caught in its gaze, frozen, unable to break free. And then it spoke. But not with words. Not with sound, even. No, this voice came directly into my mind, cold and ancient, the kind of voice that made you feel like you were hearing it not through your ears, but through the very fabric of your soul. Why do you persist? The question hung in the air, impossibly heavy. It wasn't a question meant for a reply. It was a question meant to break you, to make you question everything you thought you knew. And in that moment, I felt it, something deep inside me, something primal and terrified, told me I wasn't meant to be here. I finally managed to move, my legs shaking beneath me. I stumbled backward, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them making sense. The figure didn't follow. It just watched, silent and still. And then, like a nightmare, it faded into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had come. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I had to keep going. The men needed me. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. The fort, with all its walls and defenses, was just the beginning. We had walked straight into something that had been waiting, something that had been buried in the earth long before the war had started. I made my way back to the trench, my heart still racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had just seen. The men who had been with me, the soldiers I had trusted, where were they? What had happened to them? The questions gnawed at me, relentless, but the answers weren't coming. There was nothing to explain it. Nothing that could make sense of it. As I reached the trench, I found the others still moving, still working. The bombardment was relentless, the sound of gunfire punctuating the silence. They had no idea what had just happened. No idea what was really waiting for us inside the fort. I couldn't tell them. Not yet. Not until I knew more. But I knew one thing for sure: we weren't just fighting the Germans anymore. We weren't just fighting the war. We were fighting something older, something far darker, something that had been waiting for centuries. And whatever it wasn't going to let us leave. I glanced back toward the fort, its looming walls casting long shadows over the battlefield. The earth trembled again, a deep resonating hum, as if it was warning us, telling us to turn back. But it was too late. We had already crossed that line, and there was no turning back now. I moved through the trench, my boots sinking deeper with every step. The weight of the situation was pressing down on me harder than ever, but I couldn't let it show. I couldn't let my men see the fear creeping up my spine. Fear was the enemy now, just as much as the Germans or whatever strange force lurked within the fort. I took a breath, forcing myself to focus. We were too close now. The walls of the fort rose like ancient monoliths before us, casting a long shadow over the men below. The evening air was thick with tension, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional distant rumble of artillery. The men were moving steadily, their faces set, determined. I was proud of them for that, but I could see it in their eyes, the same unease I had felt. The whispers had begun to spread among them, the rumors of things that didn't belong, things that shouldn't be here. It wasn't just superstition, it was the collective weight of the unknown pressing on all of us. We were on the final stretch now, and I could feel the eyes of the fort upon us, even though there was nothing tangible to look at. It was as if the very stones, the very earth beneath our feet, had turned against us, unwilling to let us pass. We had reached the gates, but we weren't the first ones here, and we certainly wouldn't be the last. The air shifted again. The sound of the wind had changed, a low hum that almost vibrated in the bones. There was something happening here, something beyond our understanding. My hands shook involuntarily as I adjusted the equipment on my belt, my mind running through every scenario possible. What was waiting for us inside? Was it just the Germans holding on to their last position, or was something else at play? Whatever it was, I had no choice but to face it. I reached the edge of the gate, motioning for the men behind me to stay back. I had to clear a path through this last stretch of land, the last minefield, before we could breach the walls. I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. Was anyone? Just as I crouched down to assess the next step, there was a sudden, sharp sound, like a crack splitting the night. A bright flash of light filled the sky, and for a moment, everything was drowned out in a cacophony of sound. Explosions, gunfire, the screams of men. I felt the ground beneath me tremble again, but this time, it wasn't the vibrations from the fort. It was something much worse, something much stronger, something that felt like the very earth was cracking open. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest, as I saw a figure standing in the distance, in the midst of the battlefield. This wasn't a soldier. This wasn't even human. The figure was enormous, towering over the men around it, its body contorted, the shape barely comprehensible. Its arms stretched impossibly long, reaching for the sky, and its face, if you could call it that, was a hollow, empty void, a black abyss that seemed to swallow everything in its gaze. And it wasn't just standing there. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, toward us. I felt a cold rush of fear sweep over me, so strong it took all my willpower not to run, not to flee the battlefield. But I couldn't. The men were already in motion, running, screaming, but most of them were frozen, rooted to the spot, unable to comprehend what was happening. The figure stepped forward again, and this time I saw it clearly. Its body rippled, the air distorting around it as if it were some unnatural force, a creature that was never meant to exist in this world. It wasn't just a man, it wasn't even a ghost. It was something older than the war, older than humanity itself. I turned back to the men, shouting orders, trying to get them to move, to do something. But the words stuck in my throat. How do you fight something like that? How do you face something that shouldn't exist? The ground beneath us cracked, the earth groaning as if in agony, and then it happened. The air split open with a deafening roar. The figure was upon us, its massive hands outstretched, and in an instant, everything around me went black. The world shifted in a blink. One moment, I was on the battlefield, my senses stretched to their breaking point, the terror overwhelming every thought. The next, I was weightless, drifting in a void where sound and time, didn't seem to exist. At first, I didn't understand what had happened. I couldn't move. My body felt like it was suspended in thick, stifling air. My breath was ragged, my heart still pounding in my chest, but it felt like I was no longer in control of it. The ground I had stood on, the men I had fought beside, everything had been swallowed whole by the darkness. I was alone. But then the voice came again. Why do you persist? This time, it was louder, stronger. It reverberated through my mind like thunder cracking the sky. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a command. I opened my eyes, though I wasn't sure where I was anymore. There were no stars, no lights, no sign of the fort or the men, just an endless, swirling abyss. I couldn't move, couldn't see past the thick, oppressive blackness around me, but I could feel it. Something was watching me. Something was waiting. I wasn't alone. A figure appeared once more, only this time I could see it more clearly. It was the same as before, but its shape had begun to shift. Its form not quite human, not quite anything I could name. The creature was different, darker, more real, more tangible. Its arms were outstretched, fingers stretching toward me like claws. Its face was still a dark void, but now I could feel its eyes, or the absence of them on me. I tried to move, to run, but my legs were like lead, frozen in place by the sheer weight of the thing in front of me. The air around me thickened. Every breath I took was a struggle. My chest constricted as if the air was being drained from my lungs, and I felt an all-encompassing pressure, an invisible force pushing me down, suffocating me. And then, from somewhere deep within the darkness, another voice. A whisper, but unlike any whisper I had ever heard before. It was ancient, its tone filled with sorrow and malevolence. You cannot leave. The words wrapped around me like chains, binding me tighter with every syllable. I felt the chill of their meaning crawling up my spine, digging into my skin. They weren't just words. They were a warning. Promise. The air felt colder now, the darkness pressing in harder. I wanted to scream, to fight, but nothing came. The feeling of being trapped not just in this place, but in my own body, my own mind, was overwhelming. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted again, and I felt myself falling, not through space, but through time itself. Everything around me blurred and stretched as if I were being pulled apart. I could feel the pull of something ancient, something deeply ingrained in the earth itself, dragging me downward. The voices, one calling me, one condemning me, faded into the distance as the pull grew stronger. I hit the ground hard. It wasn't the earth beneath me. It wasn't anything solid or real. I was floating, lying in the nothingness, surrounded by an emptiness so deep I could feel it echoing in my very bones. And then, just as quickly, I was back. The cold air returned, the sound of the battlefield, of gunfire, of explosions, roared back to life. My heart was racing, my body trembling, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from relief, from a desperate grasp at reality. I was alive. I was back. But I wasn't alone. I turned my head to the side. The men, some of them were still standing. Others were on their knees. They were silent, their eyes fixed ahead, wide and unblinking. None of them spoke. None of them moved. And then I saw it. The creature was there again, standing just beyond the men, watching us all. It hadn't moved, but it had somehow gotten closer. It wasn't an illusion. It wasn't in my head. This was real. And the truth hit me hard. We were stuck. We had crossed over, somehow, and there was no way back. I stumbled toward the men, shaking them, shouting for them to move, to snap out of it. But they didn't respond. It was as though they were in a trance, locked in place by some invisible force. A force I couldn't fight. And then I realized it. I wasn't meant to be their savior. I wasn't meant to lead them out of this. There was no escape. The fort, the place we had come to take, the darkness inside it, was not just a physical structure. It was something older, something more dangerous, something that had been waiting for us to stumble upon it. As the figure in the distance took another slow step toward us, I felt a strange calm wash over me. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not in the same way. The terror I had felt before had melted away, replaced by cold understanding. This wasn't something we could fight. This was something that had been waiting, something that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface of the earth, buried beneath the weight of history. We had crossed into a place where time didn't matter, where the line between life and death had blurred, and there was no way back. In the distance, I saw the gates of the fort, towering, insurmountable. But they weren't just gates. They were a threshold. And now we had passed it. My men, were lost to the darkness, and I could only watch as the figure drew closer, its shape shifting, contorting, becoming something unimaginable. A final step. A final breath. The last attack. And then, everything went quiet. The walls of the fort, the battlefield, the war itself, all of it faded away into silence. And I was no longer alone.